You won't believe what happened at this remote cliffside camp. How one adventurer turned the tables on a gang of drunk outlaws in a way no one expected. If you love stories about hidden strength and unexpected heroes, stay tuned because this one will absolutely blow your mind. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stick around for the full story. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through the gathering dusk at Eagle's Peak Campground, a remote haven nestled high in the Colorado Rockies. Marcus Chen sat quietly by his campfire, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the subtle scars that marked his right cheek. In places he rarely spoke about, the campsite, perched near the edge of a dramatic cliff offering breathtaking views of the valley below, was his favorite spot to escape the noise of civilization. The 40-year-old adventure photographer had spent the last 3 days hiking and capturing the raw beauty of the landscape, his camera equipment carefully stored in his tent nearby. But photography wasn't his only passion. The solitude of these remote locations spoke to something deeper within him, a need for peace that had been hard-won through years of service. His muscular frame, hidden beneath layers of practical outdoor gear, didn't immediately betray his military background. But the way he carried himself, the constant awareness of his surroundings, told a different story. The evening was peaceful, the kind that reminded Marcus why he had chosen this life after leaving the Special Forces. The gentle crack of burning wood and the distant cry of an eagle, the only sounds breaking the mountain silence. He took another sip of coffee, his dark eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. More than necessity, movement caught his attention. A flicker of light from the adjacent campsite about 50 yards away, where a group of new arrivals were setting up their camp in the growing darkness. Something about their movements made Marcus pause. They were loud, uncoordinated, their voices carrying across the otherwise quiet campground. The sound of breaking glass, followed by raucous laughter, echoed off the cliff face. Marcus's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, his instincts already noting details that others might miss: the way they stumbled around their site, the aggressive tone in their voices, the careless way they handled their equipment. These weren't your typical campers. He watched as one of them, a tall man with a red bandana, stumbled near the cliff's edge, bottle in hand, laughing as his companions yanked him back. His voice carried clearly through the cool air. "Way too close to the edge, man." Another voice called out, gruff and slurred. "You trying to kill yourself before we even get started?" Marcus's hand tightened slightly around his coffee cup. He had seen groups like this before during his years of remote camping. Adventure seekers who mistook recklessness for bravery, who brought their chaos to these peaceful places. The group, 5 men in total, continued their noisy setup process, their movements becoming more erratic as they passed bottles between them. Marcus could see their faces now illuminated by their poorly constructed fire, each one marked by an edge of hostility that alcohol only amplified. Their clothes weren't those of hikers or campers, but rather what someone might wear to a bar: leather jackets. Despite the mountain weather boots more suited to motorcycles than trails, his trained eye caught other details too. The bulges in their jackets that suggested concealed weapons, the way they positioned themselves around their campsite, not like tourists, but like men used to watching their backs. The tactical vest one of them wore, partially hidden beneath his jacket, spoke of someone playing at being military, rather than someone who had actually served. Marcus had seen enough in his 20 years of service to recognize the difference. The night air grew colder, but Marcus didn't move to his tent. Instead, he remained by his fire, his presence quiet but alert. He knew from experience that groups like this often grew bolder as the night wore. On their inhibitions loosened by alcohol and isolation, he had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now every one of them was telling him to stay vigilant. A burst of argument erupted from their camp, followed by the sound of something heavy being knocked over. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he watched one of the men, the largest of the group, shove another, nearly sending him sprawling into their fire. The others laughed their amusement, carrying a cruel edge that echoed across the campground. Most of the other campers in the area Families and genuine outdoor enthusiasts had already retreated to their tents, trying to avoid drawing attention. Marcus set his coffee down and began methodically checking his immediate surroundings. Not obviously, but with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years in hostile territories. He noted the distance to his tent, the placement of his gear, the possible routes these men might take if they decided to cause trouble. He wasn't looking for a fight, but experience had taught him to be prepared. His fingers brushed against the satellite phone in his pocket, one of many precautions he always took. When camping in remote locations, the sound of breaking glass shattered the night again, followed by more drunken laughter. Marcus remained still, his presence almost invisible in the growing darkness. But his mind was already running through scenarios, analyzing potential threats, and mapping out responses. His years in special forces had taught him to think several steps ahead, to see patterns in chaos, and to prepare for multiple outcomes. It was this training that had kept him alive in far worse situations than this. As the night deepened and the mountain air grew sharper, Marcus knew that the peace of his solitary camping trip was about to be disrupted. These men weren't just noisy campers, they were trouble looking for a place to happen. And somehow, he doubted they would be content to stay within the boundaries of their own campsite for long. He took one last sip of his now cold coffee, his eyes never leaving the nearby camp as he prepared himself for whatever the night might bring. A soft glow of Marcus's campfire illuminated his small clearing, the flames dancing in rhythm with the mountain breeze. Years of outdoor experience had taught him how to build a fire that balanced visibility with efficiency, keeping him warm without broadcasting his presence too far into the darkness. He had positioned his camp strategically close enough to the cliff's edge to have a clear view of the valley below, but with enough distance to maintain solid footing and multiple escape routes. If needed, old habits that had become second nature. His site was a testament to calculated simplicity. His tent, a military-grade shelter designed for harsh conditions, stood partially concealed behind a cluster of pine trees, his gear meticulously organized and secured, the way he had learned during his years in Special Forces operations. Nothing left to chance, nothing out of place. The organization wasn't just about efficiency. It was about survival, a lesson learned through experience in environments far more hostile than this peaceful mountainside. Marcus moved with quiet precision as he prepared his evening meal. His movements economical and purposeful. Despite the seemingly relaxed setting, he kept his attention split between his tasks and the increasingly rowdy group at the neighboring campsite. The sound of their voices had grown louder, more aggressive as the alcohol continued to flow through their system, their laughter taking on a harder edge that set his teeth on edge. The crisp mountain air carried their conversations clearly across the space between camps, their words becoming more hostile with each passing hour. They weren't even trying to hide their nature anymore, their talk filled with references to past confrontations and plans for future trouble. Marcus caught fragments of their discussion that made his combat-trained instincts bristle, mentions of recent altercations with other campers in different locations, discussions of weapons and techniques for intimidations. Eyes caught the glint of metal as one of them pulled something from his jacket, the firelight reflecting off what appeared to be brass knuckles. The man with the red bandana was showing them off to his companions, bragging about a recent encounter that had left someone hospitalized. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he continued his preparations. His hands steady, but his mind already cataloging every detail, every potential threat. The mountain night was typically peaceful at this hour, most campers settling in to enjoy the natural beauty of their surroundings. But these men were different. Their presence felt like a storm brewing on the horizon, threatening to break at any moment. Families in nearby campsites had already doused their fires and retreated into their tents, trying to become invisible to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Marcus understood their instinct, but he didn't share it. He had faced worse odds, in more dangerous places. As he worked, he kept his movements deliberately casual, but his senses remained sharp, taking in every detail of his surroundings, the way the wind shifted through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and approaching rain. The subtle changes in the ambient sounds of the wilderness, and most importantly, the positioning and movements of the troublemakers nearby. He noted how they had arranged themselves around their fire, their positioning suggesting experience with intimidation tactics rather than genuine camping expertise. The largest of the group, a man Marcus mentally dubbed Tank for his size and aggressive demeanor, seemed to be the unofficial leader, his voice carrying authority as he directed the others. His massive frame enhanced by what appeared to be prison yard muscle rather than military training. Marcus had seen his type before during his deployments, men who confused brutality with strength, who relied on intimidation rather than skill. Another member of the group, smaller but wiry, with quick nervous movements, caught Marcus's attention. The way he kept scanning the surrounding campsites suggested he was their lookout, probably experienced in keeping watch during less legal activities. His hand kept straying to his waistband where Marcus had already noticed the outline of a concealed weapon. The motion was subtle but clear to someone trained to spot such details. The remaining 3 members of the group followed Tank's lead, their behavior becoming more emboldened with each round of drinks they shared. Marcus watched as they began to venture further from their own sight, their movements becoming more territorial, as if claiming the entire area as their domain. One of them stumbled near the cliff's edge, again leading to another round of cruel laughter that echoed across the campground. Marcus continued his evening routine with practiced ease, but his mind was already processing, analyzing, planning. He knew from experience that men like these wouldn't be content with simply disrupting the peace. They would look for entertainment, likely at someone else's expense. The question wasn't if they would cause trouble, but when and where they would choose to start it. The temperature dropped further as night settled in fully over the mountains, but Marcus didn't retreat to his tent. Instead, he maintained his position by the fire. His presence subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention, his campsite remained organized, efficient, ready for any situation that might develop. He had learned long ago that preparation often meant the difference between life and death, whether in combat zones or seemingly peaceful camping grounds. A sharp crack of breaking wood followed. By more drunken laughter drew his attention back to the group's camp. They had begun breaking apart their wooden chairs, using the pieces to build their fire higher than was safe or necessary. The flames now reached dangerous heights, sending sparks floating toward the surrounding trees. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly at their recklessness, but he remained still, watching, waiting, his patience honed by years of experience in situations where acting too quickly could be just as dangerous as acting too late. Marcus observed the group's escalating behavior with the calm detachment of someone who had spent years reading hostile situations. Tank and his crew had moved from mere rowdiness to deliberate provocation, wandering between campsites. Their shadows long and menacing in the firelight, Marcus noticed how other campers shrunk away as the group passed by their tents, a young couple hurriedly gathering their children and moving their camp further from the growing chaos. The mountain air had grown sharp with tension, a stark contrast to the peaceful solitude that typically defined Eagle's Peak. Marcus watched as Tank made his way toward a nearby campsite where an elderly man was quietly reading by lantern light. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he set his book down, sensing the threat that approached him. "Hey, Pops!" Tank called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that made Marcus's combat instincts sharpen. "Got any beer to share with your neighbors?" The elderly man shook his head apologetically. "No, sorry, I don't drink." Tank's friendly demeanor shifted instantly, his massive frame looming over the seated man. "That's not very neighborly," he growled, his companions spreading out around the campsite in a practiced formation that spoke of experience in intimidation. Marcus could see the fear in the old man's eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped his chair before the situation could escalate further. Marcus stood up, his movement deliberate but unhurried. "Hey," he called out, his voice calm, but carrying enough authority to draw their attention. "Maybe you should leave him alone." The group turned their focus, shifting to this new potential target. Tank's eyes narrowed as he assessed Marcus, taking in his athletic build and confident stance. "Mind your own business, camper." Tank sneered. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Marcus stepped forward, keeping his movements measured and controlled, his eyes never leaving Tank's face. The firelight revealed the subtle scars on his forearms, testament to years of combat experience that his casual camping attire couldn't quite conceal. "This is my business," he replied, his voice level, but edged with steel. "When you start harassing other campers." Tank's companions exchanged glances, their drunken bravado momentarily shaken by Marcus's calm assertion. The wiry lookout shifted nervously, his hand straying toward his concealed weapon, but Marcus had already noted the movement, his own stance adjusting imperceptibly to account for potential threats. "You got a problem with how we have fun?" Tank demanded, taking a step toward Marcus, attempting to use his size to intimidate. Marcus didn't move, holding his ground with the stillness of someone who had faced far worse threats. "I've got a problem with bullies," Marcus stated, his voice carrying across the quiet campground. Ordinary campers might have missed the subtle shift in his posture, but Tank's crew, being experienced in confrontation, sensed the change, the way he balanced his weight. The alertness in his stance suggested this wasn't just another camper they could intimidate. Tank's face darkened with anger, his previous uncertainty replaced by wounded pride. The elderly man seized the moment of distraction to retreat to his tent. Marcus noted his escape with satisfaction, but kept his attention focused on the immediate threat. Tank and his crew had formed a loose semicircle, their previous target forgotten as they focused. "On this new challenge, you should have stayed out of it, old man." Tank growled, his alcohol-fueled confidence returning. Marcus almost smiled at the irony of being called old by someone who clearly didn't recognize the signs of military experience. The tension in the air thickened as Tank's crew spread out further, their movements suggesting they were used to overwhelming opponents through superior numbers. Marcus remained still, his mind already calculating angles, distances, and potential scenarios. His special forces training had taught him to analyze threats instinctively, to see patterns in chaos, and to prepare for multiple outcomes simultaneously. One of Tank's crew, a man with a distinctive neck tattoo, stepped forward, attempting to flank Marcus, but stopped short when Marcus's gaze flicked to him briefly, the intensity in that look making him reconsider his position. Marcus had seen that reaction before in various combat zones, when adversaries realized too late they had underestimated. Their opponent, the mountain knight, had grown eerily quiet, even the wildlife seeming to sense the impending confrontation. Tank took another step forward, his massive frame highlighted by the campfire's glow. "You think you're tough, guy," he sneered, his voice carrying a threat that would have intimidated most people. But Marcus saw past the bravado, noting the subtle signs of uncertainty in Tank's posture. "I think," Marcus replied, his voice steady, "that you should reconsider your choices." His words were measured, calm, but carried an unmistakable warning. The wiry lookout muttered something to Tank, his eyes darting between Marcus and the surrounding darkness. Something about Marcus's demeanor had clearly unsettled him. Tank hesitated for a moment, his alcohol-addled mind trying to process the situation he found himself in. This wasn't going according to their usual script. Their typical tactics of intimidation seemed to bounce off this stranger like water off steel. Marcus's eyes swept the group, taking in every detail from their nervous shifting to their poorly concealed weapons. His expression remained neutral, but his mind was already mapping out multiple scenarios, planning responses to various potential threats. He had faced similar situations before, in places far more dangerous than this remote campsite. But the principles remained the same. Read the opponent, anticipate their moves, and maintain control of the situation. The atmosphere crackled with tension as both sides assessed each other. Tank's crew, used to easy victories over unprepared campers, found themselves facing someone who radiated quiet confidence and controlled power. Marcus, for his part, remained perfectly still, his presence a reminder that true strength often lies in restraint rather than aggression. The next move would determine how this night would unfold, and Marcus was prepared for whatever choice they made. As the tension mounted, Marcus's mind flashed back to his early days in Special Forces training, specifically to a lesson that had shaped his approach to conflict resolution. His instructor, Sergeant Rivera, had drilled into them the importance of reading situations before they escalated. "Your mind is your strongest weapon," Rivera's voice echoed in his memory. Clear as the mountain air around him, the ability to analyze and control a situation before it turns violent, that's what separates warriors from thugs. Marcus applied those lessons, now carefully observing the subtle details of the confrontation unfolding before him. Tank's aggressive posture betrayed his prison background, the way he positioned himself, the unconscious movements that suggested he was used to having walls at his back rather than open space. The rest of his crew showed similar tells, their attempted intimidation tactics more suited to confined spaces than this open mountainside. The wiry lookout continued to shift nervously, his eyes darting between Marcus and their surroundings. Marcus recognized the behavior of someone used to operating in urban environments, who felt exposed in this wilderness, setting the man's hand kept, straying to his concealed weapon, but his movements lacked the confidence of someone with proper training. Tank took another step forward, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he growled clearly, unsettled by Marcus's calm. Assessment. Marcus remained still, his posture relaxed but ready, his mind categorizing potential threats and escape routes just as he had been trained. The cliff edge lay 30 yards to his left. The dense tree line 40 yards behind him. He had already noted several natural barriers he could use for cover if needed. Not that he expected this confrontation to reach that point. The group's body language suggested they were more used to intimidation than actual combat. The tactical training kicked in automatically, Marcus's eyes tracking each member of the group, noting their positions relative to each other. Their likely reaction times their obvious weaknesses. Tank's bulk made him slower than he appeared. The way he favored his right leg suggested an old injury. The lookout's nervous energy would make him prone to mistakes under pressure. These weren't hardened fighters. They were bullies used to preying on the unprepared. In the flickering firelight, Marcus caught glimpses of their pasts, written in their behavior and appearance, prison tattoos, nervous tics, the kind of forced bravado that came from wanting to appear more dangerous than you actually were. He had seen it countless times during his deployments, local tough guys who mistook aggression for strength. Marcus kept his breathing steady, his heart rate controlled as he had learned through years of high-stress situations. Tank's crew had spread out now, attempting to surround Marcus, but their positioning was amateur, revealing their lack of actual tactical training. They left gaps in their formation, missed obvious angles of approach that any trained operative would have covered. Marcus almost smiled at their predictability, remembering similar scenarios from his combat days, when overconfident opponents had made the mistake of underestimating him. The mountain night had grown silent around them. Even the usual sounds of wildlife stilled, as if nature itself was watching, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. The only sounds were the crackling of nearby campfires and the increasingly agitated breathing of Tank and his crew. Marcus could sense their growing unease, his calculated stillness clearly unnerving them. They were used to victims who showed fear, who tried to run or beg. These trained responses were useless against someone who showed neither fear nor aggression. A flash of memory surfaced. Another training session, with Sergeant Rivera teaching them about psychological warfare. Sometimes the most effective weapon is stillness, Rivera had said. Make them wonder what you know that they don't. Marcus applied that lesson now, letting his calm presence speak louder than any threats or posturing could. Tank shifted his weight again, visibly frustrated by his inability to provoke a reaction. The rest of the group watched the exchange, their earlier drunken confidence beginning to fade in the face of Marcus's unwavering composure. One of them, the man with the neck tattoo, took a half step backward, his eyes darting between Tank and Marcus, as if reassessing the situation. Marcus noted the movement, filing it away as a potential weak point in their group dynamic. He had seen similar cracks form in hostile units before when confronted with unexpected resistance. Tank's voice cut through the tension again, this time with a hint of desperation in his attempted threat. You think you're tough, old man, but numbers don't lie. We've got you surrounded. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady and controlled, addressing the group rather than just their leader. "Your numbers mean less than you think," he said simply, "when you don't know how to use them." The words landed, with precision causing several of Tank's crew to exchange uncertain glances. The wiry lookout muttered something to Tank too low for the others to hear, but Marcus read his lips, catching references to leaving and avoiding trouble. Tank brushed him off with a growl, but Marcus could see the seed of doubt had been planted. His years of experience in reading hostile situations told him the group's unity was beginning to fracture exactly as he had anticipated. The mountain air grew colder around them, but Marcus didn't feel it. His focus remained absolute, every sense alert to the shifting dynamics of the confrontation. Tank took another aggressive step forward, trying to salvage his authority over the situation. But Marcus saw the uncertainty in his movements, the subtle tells that suggested he was operating outside his comfort zone. "You trying to tell us how to handle our business?" Old Man Tank demanded, his voice rising in pitch, betraying his growing unease. Marcus remained motionless, his eyes steady on Tank's face. "I'm trying to give you a chance to walk away," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of experience that made the words more than just a suggestion. The firelight cast shifting shadows across the scene, highlighting the growing tension in Tank's crew. Their formation had become sloppy gaps, widening as individual members began to question their position in this confrontation. Marcus knew this. Moment Well had seen it unfold countless times in various combat zones, when aggressors suddenly realized they might have chosen the wrong target. His training had taught him to recognize these pivotal moments, and more importantly, how to use them to his advantage. The atmosphere shifted as Tank's composure cracked his earlier bravado, giving way to visible frustration. He wasn't used to victims who stood their ground, let alone those who seemed to read his crew's every move. Marcus watched as the large man's hands clenched and unclenched, the gesture betraying his inner struggle between backing down and escalating further. "You've got some nerve." Marcus noted the slight tremor in Tank's voice, the way his eyes darted briefly to his companions seeking reassurance. Marcus's mind flashed to another training session. This one focused on identifying psychological weaknesses in hostile forces. Sergeant Rivera's words resonated clearly through the years of memory. "Look for the cracks." In their confidence, he had said, "That's where you'll find your advantage." Marcus could see those cracks forming now in the way Tank's crew shifted uneasily in their positions, their earlier unified front beginning to show signs of strain. The wiry lookout had backed up several paces, his hand still hovering near his concealed weapon, but his body language screaming uncertainty. Marcus kept his attention split, reading each member of the group while maintaining his focus on Tank. He noted how the man with the neck tattoo kept glancing toward the tree line, as if contemplating an escape route. These weren't the actions of hardened criminals, but rather bullies who had suddenly found themselves out of their depth. "I'm giving you one last chance," Tank declared, his voice carrying less conviction than before, trying to salvage what remained of his authority. But Marcus caught the undertone of uncertainty. That comment earned a nervous laugh from one of the crew, quickly silenced by Tank's glare. Marcus remained perfectly still, his presence somehow becoming more commanding through his deliberate lack of movement. The flickering firelight revealed decades of experience etched into his weathered features. Marcus's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the calm authority of someone who had faced far worse threats in far more dangerous places than this mountain campsite. "I think you should count your blessings," he said evenly, "and walk away while you still can." The words hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. Tank's crew exchanged glances, their earlier cockiness replaced by growing doubt. Marcus could almost see the thoughts running through their minds as they reassessed their situation. The mountain wind picked up, slightly carrying with it the scent of pine and wood smoke. Marcus used the moment to shift his stance, subtly adjusting his position in a way that only trained eyes would recognize as tactical. Several of Tank's crew took involuntary steps backward, their instincts warning them, even if they didn't understand why the wiry lookout's face had grown pale. His nervous energy now tinged with something closer to fear. A memory surfaced of another confrontation years ago in a different environment, Where Marcus had faced down a group of insurgents using nothing but presence and psychological warfare, Rivera had taught them that sometimes the most effective weapon was the enemy's imagination. Let them wonder, he had said. Let them question everything. They think they know about you. Marcus applied that lesson now, letting his silence speak volumes, allowing Tank's crew to fill in the blanks with their own fears. Tank made one last attempt to assert dominance, taking an aggressive step forward, but Marcus saw the hesitation in his movement, the way his foot faltered slightly before completing the step. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Tank sneered, but the words lacked their earlier menace. Marcus didn't respond immediately, instead, letting his gaze sweep over the group with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years evaluating threats in combat zones. "Special, no." Marcus finally replied, his voice carrying a hint of something that made several of Tank's crew step back. Experienced, his eyes met Tank's gaze, holding it with an intensity that made the larger man blink first. Yes, the simple admission carried more weight than any threat could have. Tank's face showed confusion, then a flicker of recognition, as he finally began to notice details he had missed before. The way Marcus held himself, the subtle scars, the absolute confidence that came, not from bravado, but from years of actual combat. Marcus watched as understanding slowly dawned on Tank's face. "You're military," Tank said, his voice suddenly uncertain. Marcus allowed himself a small nod but didn't elaborate. Letting Tank's imagination fill in the details, he could see the calculations running behind Tank's eyes as the man finally began to grasp the situation. He had wandered into the mountain night, seemed to grow quieter, as if nature itself was waiting to see how this revelation
would play out. The wiry lookout broke first. "Hey, Tank, maybe we should." His voice trailed off as Tank shot him a glare. But Marcus could see the damage was done. The group's confidence had crumbled, replaced by the growing realization that they had
made a serious miscalculation. Marcus maintained his position, his presence somehow becoming more imposing without him moving a muscle. Decades of special forces training had taught him that often the most effective victory was the one achieved without throwing a single punch. Tank's crew had begun to back away, their formation completely broken. Now individuals looking to their leader for guidance but finding only uncertainty. Marcus recognized the moment when a hostile force realizes it has lost not through violence, but through the simple revelation that they are outmatched. He had seen it countless times before in various combat zones, when aggressors suddenly understood they had chosen the wrong target. The firelight cast long shadows as Tank struggled with his decision. His earlier bravado warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Marcus waited patiently, knowing that sometimes the most effective strategy was to let an opponent talk themselves into retreat. "You could have just told us," Tank muttered. Finally, his tone almost accusatory. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "I did," he replied quietly. "You just weren't listening." The words carried an edge of truth that made Tank flinch. The tension in the air crystallized. As Tank took a step backward, his massive frame no longer projecting the same intimidating presence, Marcus watched the shift in dynamics with experienced eyes, noting how the rest of the crew seemed to draw back unconsciously, following their leaders. Retreat. Thunder rolled in the distance, a low, warning rumble that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. The mountain weather promising a storm that matched the atmosphere of confrontation. Tank's face twisted with a mixture of anger and uncertainty, his pride warring with his instinct for self-preservation. "You think being military makes you untouchable," he spat, but the words lacked conviction. Marcus remained still, his silence more effective than any verbal response could have been. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful message was conveyed through controlled stillness rather than action or words. The wiry lookout had completely abandoned his aggressive posture, now hovering at the edge of the group, his nervous energy having transformed into barely concealed fear. Marcus noted how his hand had moved away from his concealed weapon, a subtle admission of defeat that spoke volumes about the changing situation. "Tank, hey man, maybe we should just..." The lookout started, but Tank cut him off with a sharp gesture, though Marcus could see the uncertainty in Tank's eyes. Growing Marcus's mind flashed to a training exercise in the mountains of Afghanistan, where his unit had learned the art of psychological warfare without weapons. Sergeant Rivera's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who doesn't need to prove anything. Marcus embodied that lesson now, his calm presence more threatening than any display of aggression. Could have been the years of combat experience evident in his controlled stillness. The mountain wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of rain, and the sharp scent of Pine Tank's crew had spread out further, but not in their earlier attempt at intimidation. Now they were unconsciously creating escape routes Marcus recognized. The behavior having seen it countless times in hostile forces when they realized they had miscalculated their advantage, the casual camping clothes he wore couldn't hide the military bearing that years of special forces service had ingrained in him. Remember what I said about choices. Marcus spoke, his voice carrying across the tense space between them. The words seemingly casual, but laden with meaning. Tank's jaw clenched, his previous bravado crumbling in the face of this unexpected challenge. He had clearly expected an easy target, another camper to intimidate. Instead, he had found someone whose quiet confidence spoke of experiences far beyond anything Tank and his crew had encountered. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance around them, emphasizing the growing distance between Tank's crew and their intended victim. Marcus maintained his position. His stance relaxed, but ready years of combat operations had taught him to remain prepared, even when victory seemed assured. He watched as Tank's companions shifted nervously, their earlier unity completely dissolved in the face of this unexpected resistance. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the scene in stark clarity. For a brief moment, Marcus caught glimpses of the fear now evident on the faces of Tank's crew, their expressions revealing the dawning realization that they had severely underestimated their opponent. Tank made one final attempt to salvage his authority, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "You can't watch everyone all the time, old man. We'll remember this." Marcus allowed himself a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you do," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of experience that made the words more than just a casual response. Tank's crew exchanged glances, their earlier confidence replaced by an urgent desire to be anywhere else. The mountain night seemed to close in around them, the approaching storm adding to the growing sense of unease. The wiry lookout was the first to break formation, completely stepping back toward their campsite with obvious relief. Tank shot him a glare, but even he seemed to recognize the futility of maintaining their aggressive stance. Marcus had faced down insurgents in combat zones, terrorists in urban environments, and hostiles in conditions far worse than this mountain campsite. He knew the exact moment when opponents realized they had lost without a single blow being struck. Thunder crashed closer now, as if nature itself was emphasizing the defeat of Tank's crew. Marcus remained motionless, his presence a reminder of the power of controlled strength over brute force. He had learned this lesson early in his Special Forces career, that true victory often came, not from overwhelming force, but from the ability to control a situation through presence and psychological advantage. Tank took another step backward, his massive frame no longer attempting to dominate the space between them. "Fine," he growled, but his voice had lost its menace. "We're done here for now." Marcus didn't respond verbally, his steady gaze more effective than any words could have been. He watched as Tank's crew retreated, their movements hasty and uncoordinated. So different from their earlier swaggering approach. The mountain wind carried the sound of their muttered curses and recriminations as they withdrew. The tension began to dissipate like morning mist in sunlight. Though Marcus maintained his vigilance, he had seen too many situations turn volatile in their final moments to relax completely. The elderly man whose harassment had triggered this confrontation peered cautiously from his tent. Marcus caught his grateful nod with a slight acknowledgement, never taking his full attention from Tank's retreating crew. Rain began to fall in heavy drops, as if the mountain itself was washing away the remnants of the confrontation. Marcus remained by his fire, His posture relaxed but his senses still alert, watching as Tank and his crew hastily gathered their belongings, their earlier bravado replaced by an almost frantic desire to leave the campsite. The transformation from predators to retreating adversaries was complete, a change Marcus had witnessed many times before in various combat situations, when aggressors suddenly realized they had chosen the wrong target at the wrong time. Thunder rumbled overhead as Marcus watched Tank's crew retreat to their campsite, his mind drifting back to another time. Another confrontation that had shaped his understanding of controlled conflict, the Valley of Korangal, Afghanistan, 2008. The memory surfaced with crystal clarity. As sharp as the mountain air around him, it had been during his second deployment with Special Forces, a mission that would teach him more about psychological warfare than any training exercise could. Their unit had been tasked with securing a strategic mountain passage, a narrow corridor that local insurgents had been using to transport weapons. The mission seemed straightforward until they encountered a situation that would change Marcus's approach to conflict forever. Their team had come across a group of heavily armed fighters, but instead of immediately engaging, Sergeant Rivera had demonstrated the power of psychological dominance. Marcus remembered the scene vividly, the way Rivera had stood calm and controlled in the face of superior numbers, his presence alone causing the insurgents to question their position. "We don't always need bullets to win a fight," Rivera had said afterward. "Sometimes the strongest weapon is making your opponent realize they've already lost the lesson." Had stuck with Marcus, shaping his approach to confrontation throughout his military career. The rain began to fall harder now, thick drops hissing as they hit his campfire, but Marcus barely noticed, his mind still caught in the memory of that Afghan. Mountain Pass. Rivera had taught them to read people, to understand the psychology of confrontation, to recognize when opponents were operating from a position of false confidence rather than true strength. Watch their eyes. Rivera's voice echoed. In his memory, real killers don't need to prove anything. It's the pretenders who try too hard. Tank and his crew reminded Marcus of those pretenders he had encountered throughout his career. Men who confused aggression with strength, who relied on numbers and intimidation rather than actual skill. He watched as they stumbled around their campsite, arguing among themselves, their earlier unity completely shattered by the revelation that they had challenged someone beyond their capabilities. The rain seemed to wash away their remaining bravado, leaving only the truth of their nature exposed. The memory shifted to another training exercise. This one focused on maintaining control in hostile situations. Rivera had put them through countless scenarios, teaching them that true power lay not in the ability to inflict violence, but in the capacity to prevent it. Marcus remembered the grueling hours spent learning to read body language, to recognize threats before they manifested, to understand the difference between those who posed real danger and those who merely played at being dangerous. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the campground in stark relief. Marcus could see Tank's crew hastily packing their gear, their movements uncoordinated and panicked, so different from their earlier swaggering confidence. He thought back to his final training exercise with Rivera, where they had learned to turn an opponent's psychological state against them. Sometimes the best weapon is patience. Rivera had said, "Let them defeat themselves." The memory of that lesson was particularly relevant now, as Marcus observed the deteriorating morale of Tank's group. He had seen it before in combat zones, how quickly false bravado could crumble when confronted with genuine capability, the way aggressors often broke formation and retreated when they realized they had miscalculated their advantage. Rivera had taught them to recognize these moments, to understand how psychological dominance could accomplish what physical force might not. Thunder crashed overhead as Marcus's mind returned to another critical moment in his training, the day Rivera had taught them about the power of presence. You carry your experiences with you. He had said they show in how you move, how you stand, how you face threats. The lesson had been demonstrated when Rivera, without weapons or backup, had faced down a group of armed insurgents using nothing but his presence and psychological control. Marcus applied those lessons, now maintaining his vigilant but relaxed posture. Even as Tank's crew scrambled to leave their campsite, he remembered Rivera's words about the aftermath of confrontation. Watch them carefully even in retreat. They'll show you who they really are. The truth of those words was evident in how Tank's group had devolved from a unified force into a scattered collection of individuals, each trying to distance themselves from their failed attempt at intimidation. The rain continued to fall steadily, the sound mixing with the distant rumble of thunder. Marcus's mind drifted to his final deployment where he had put Rivera's teachings to the ultimate test, facing down a group of hostile forces, not with weapons, but with psychological warfare. The experience had confirmed everything Rivera had taught them about the power of controlled presence, the ability to diffuse situations through understanding rather than force Tank's voice carried across the campground, barely audible over the storm, as he berated his crew there. Retreat now in full swing. Marcus remembered Rivera's words about victory. The best wins are the ones where no blood is shed, where your opponent chooses to walk away, believing it was their idea. The wisdom of those words was playing out before him, as Tank's crew without a single punch thrown had decided that retreat was their best option. Lightning illuminated the sky again, briefly showing Tank's face twisted with frustration and wounded pride. Marcus recognized the expression, having seen it countless times in combat zones when aggressors realized too late that they had chosen the wrong target. Rivera had taught them to recognize these moments of realization, to understand that true victory often came not from defeating an opponent, but from making them question their own choices. The memory of Rivera's final lesson surfaced clear and profound. Remember, he had said, "The strongest warrior is the one who knows when not to fight." The truth of those words had guided Marcus through countless confrontations during his service, and now here in this peaceful mountain campground, they proved their worth again as he watched Tank's crew retreat their earlier threats, and bravado washed away by the realization that they had encountered someone far beyond their ability to intimidate. The storm intensified its fury, matching the tension that still lingered in the mountain air. Marcus watched from his position as Tank's crew struggled with their hasty retreat, their movements becoming more desperate as the rain pelted down around them. Their earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by an almost frantic desire to escape the situation they had created. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark detail, showing the transformation from predators to prey. Tank's massive frame moved through the rain, his attempts to maintain authority over his crew growing increasingly futile. Marcus observed their disorganized evacuation with the practiced eye of someone who had seen countless hostile forces break under pressure. The wiry lookout had already thrown his gear haphazardly into their vehicle, while the others argued about what to take and what to leave behind. Their unity completely shattered. The rain drummed steadily against the ground, creating small rivers that flowed toward the cliff's edge. Marcus maintained his vigilance, even as the group retreated, his training never allowing him to completely lower his guard. He had seen too many situations turn volatile in their final moments to relax entirely. His mind was already processing, analyzing, ensuring that their retreat wasn't a feint or distraction, something his years in special forces had taught him to consider. Through the curtain of rain, Marcus caught fragments of their heated discussion. Tank's voice raised in frustration as he tried to salvage some semblance of control over his crew. "Shut up and pack faster, man. The cops could show up any minute." The words carried clearly through the storm, revealing their true nature. Common criminals, rather than the hardened outlaws they had pretended to be. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, remembering Rivera's words about how pressure revealed truth. Elderly camper whose harassment had triggered the confrontation emerged briefly from his tent to watch the group's departure, his expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. Marcus acknowledged him with a slight nod, but kept his primary focus. On Tank's crew, he had learned through experience that retreating opponents could be just as dangerous as advancing ones, especially when their pride had been wounded. Thunder crashed overhead as Tank made one final attempt to assert his authority over the situation. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "This isn't over." Marcus didn't respond. knowing his silence would be more effective than any verbal reply. He simply maintained his position, his presence a reminder of why they were leaving in such a hurry. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last remnants of their attempted intimidation. The group's vehicle roared to life, its headlights cutting through the rain as they prepared to depart. Marcus noted how they piled in, randomly abandoned their previous hierarchical seating arrangement, another sign of their broken morale. Their hasty exit kicked up mud and gravel as they sped away from the campground, leaving behind scattered equipment and trash in their wake, evidence of their disorganized retreat, as their taillights disappeared into the rainy darkness. Marcus finally allowed himself to relax slightly. Though he maintained his awareness of his surroundings, the storm continued its assault. On the mountain, the wind whipping through the trees with increasing intensity, he moved methodically, checking his perimeter, ensuring nothing had been disturbed during the confrontation. His movements practiced and efficient. The elderly camper approached. Cautiously, "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying genuine gratitude. "I didn't know what they were going to do." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the thanks but keeping his response measured. "They won't be back," he assured the man, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. The older man seemed to study him for a moment, as if seeing him properly for the first time. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scattered remains of Tank's campsite. Empty bottles, overturned chairs, and abandoned equipment, telling the story of their hasty departure. Marcus knew from experience that groups like this rarely returned once their confidence had been broken, especially when they realized they had encountered someone beyond their ability to intimidate. The rain would wash away their presence, but the lesson would remain. The storm's intensity began to ease slightly, as if nature itself was acknowledging the resolution of the conflict. Marcus conducted one final sweep of the area, his trained eye noting details that others might miss, checking for any potential threats that might have been overlooked. The mountain night had returned to its natural rhythm, the sound of rain and distant thunder replacing the earlier chaos of confrontation. Marcus reflected on the evening's events, how quickly the situation had escalated and how effectively it had been resolved without a single punch thrown. He thought about Tank's crew, their false bravado stripped away by the simple revelation that they had challenged someone who understood real conflict, someone who had faced genuine threats in environments far more hostile than this peaceful mountain campground. The elderly camper had returned to his tent, but others began to emerge from their shelters as word spread that the threat had passed. Marcus noticed their grateful glances, their relief palpable in the rainy night. He had seen this before in various combat zones. How quickly and dire atmosphere could shift from fear to relief when a threat was neutralized. The rain continued to fall steadily, but the tension had dissipated, replaced by a sense of security. Thunder rumbled in the distance, now moving away from the campground. Marcus began to secure his own site for the night, his movements precise and methodical. Even in the aftermath of conflict, he maintained the habits ingrained by years of service, checking and rechecking his surroundings, ensuring everything was in its proper place. His mind already processing the events, analyzing what had worked and what could have been done differently. The mountain night settled into a peaceful rhythm, the storm gradually moving off into the distance, leaving behind a cleaned and refreshed atmosphere. Marcus knew that while the immediate threat had been resolved, vigilance was still necessary. He had learned through experience that situations like these could have unexpected repercussions, but for now, at least peace had returned to Eagles Peak Campground, the night's event serving as a reminder that sometimes the most effective victory was the one achieved without violence. Dawn broke over Eagles Peak. The morning light, revealing a transformed campground washed clean by the night's storm. Marcus sat by his rekindled fire, a fresh cup of coffee warming his hands as he surveyed the aftermath of the previous night's confrontation. Tank's abandoned campsite stood as mute testimony to their hasty departure, scattered debris and muddy tracks, telling the story of their retreat more eloquently than words could have. The morning air carried a crisp freshness that only mountain storms could bring. But Marcus's vigilance hadn't wavered, his trained eyes continuously scanning the surroundings, even as he appeared to casually sip his coffee. Other campers had begun to emerge from their tents, many offering grateful nods or quiet words of thanks as they passed his sight. He acknowledged them with simple gestures, maintaining his alert but unassuming presence. As the sun climbed higher, Marcus's mind worked through the events of the night, analyzing each moment, each decision with the precision that years of Special Forces training had ingrained in him. He thought about Tank's crew, their attempted intimidation, their subsequent retreat, and the lessons that could be drawn from the encounter. His experience had taught him that even peaceful moments like this morning's quiet aftermath required careful attention. The elderly camper whose harassment had triggered the confrontation approached Marcus's sight, carefully balancing 2 plates of breakfast. "I thought you might be hungry," he said. Setting one of the plates down, his voice carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with the previous night's tension. Marcus accepted the offering with a quiet thank you, though his attention never fully left his surroundings, the habit of maintaining awareness too deeply ingrained to ignore. "You were military, weren't you?" the older man asked, settling into a camp chair, his eyes showing a knowing glance that suggested his own history with service. Marcus nodded slightly. "Special Forces," he admitted after a moment's consideration, seeing no reason to hide it. Now the elderly man's eyes widened slightly with understanding. "I thought so," he replied. "There's a way you carry yourself. Can't hide that kind of training." Marcus listened. As the older man introduced himself as Frank, a retired Marine who had served in Vietnam, the conversation flowed easily between them, the shared language of veterans creating an immediate understanding. Frank's eyes occasionally drifted to Tank's. "Abandoned campsite, those boys bit off more than they could chew," he remarked with a slight smile. Marcus nodded, remembering Rivera's words about how bullies often mistake aggression for strength. The morning progressed quietly, other campers gradually
returning to their normal routines, the fear from the previous night, replaced by a sense of security that Marcus's presence had created. He noticed how they moved more confidently, now their earlier tension dissolved by the knowledge that someone
capable watched over the campground. Small children played near their tents while parents prepared breakfast, the peaceful scene a stark contrast to the previous night's chaos. As Marcus and Frank talked, their conversation naturally turned to their respective service experiences, though both men carefully avoided the darker details that civilians didn't need to hear. "It's different now, isn't it?" Frank observed, watching a family unpack their camping gear. "People don't understand what it means to serve what it teaches you." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what the older veteran meant about how military service shaped a person's perspective long after their active duty had ended. The sun had fully risen, now illuminating the cliff face and casting long shadows across the campground. Marcus noticed movement at the edge of the tree line, his body tensing slightly until he recognized it as a young deer cautiously approaching the abandoned campsite, nature reclaiming its territory after the human disruption had passed. Frank caught the subtle shift in Marcus's posture and smiled appreciatively. "Old habits," he commented, "die hard." Marcus allowed himself a small smile in return, remembering countless similar moments during his service when heightened awareness had meant the difference between life and death. Even here in this peaceful setting, those instincts remained sharp, ready to activate at a moment's notice. He thought about Tank and his crew, wondering if they had learned anything from their encounter, or if they would simply move on to easier targets in other locations. As the morning wore on, other campers began to clean up Tank's abandoned site, working together to restore the area to its natural state. Marcus watched their cooperative effort with appreciation, noting how adversity often brought out the best in people. He had seen this phenomenon before in various combat zones. How communities could unite in the face of common threats. Though this peaceful mountain setting was far removed from those battlefield experiences, Frank shared stories of his own service days, his experiences in Vietnam providing a different perspective on conflict and its resolution. Marcus listened attentively, recognizing the therapeutic value of veterans sharing their experiences while maintaining the unspoken understanding that some details would remain unshared. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "these mountains remind me of the highlands near Kaisan, same kind of silence before things go wrong." The comment resonated with Marcus, who had experienced similar moments in Afghanistan's mountain ranges, where peaceful settings could transform. Instantly into combat zones, his training had taught him to appreciate peace while remaining prepared for its disruption. A balance that had served him well both in service and civilian life. He thought about how those lessons applied to situations, like last night's confrontation, where awareness and preparation had prevented potential violence. The morning sun had warmed the campground considerably, now drying the last remnants of the storm. Marcus noticed how the other campers had begun to relax, fully returning to their vacation activities with renewed enthusiasm. Children played tag between the trees while parents prepared lunch, the peaceful scene serving as a reminder of why he had chosen this location for his own retreat, a balance of solitude and community that mountain campgrounds provided. Frank eventually stood preparing to return to his own site, his departure marked by a respectful nod that carried more meaning than words could express. Marcus watched him go, reflecting on how shared experiences created bonds that transcended time and circumstance. He remained by his fire, maintaining his quiet vigilance, even as the day settled into a peaceful rhythm, his presence a reassuring constant for the other campers who had witnessed last night's events. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and morning coffee as Marcus began preparing for his own day's activities, his camera equipment waiting patiently in his tent, but his mind remained alert, processing, analyzing, ensuring that the peace they now enjoyed remained unbroken. He had learned through experience that sometimes the aftermath of confrontation required as much attention as the conflict itself, the quiet moments often revealing details that might have been missed in more intense situations. As the day progressed, Marcus prepared his photography equipment for an afternoon shoot, his movements precise and methodical, just as they had been during his Special Forces days. The familiar weight of his camera gear provided a different kind of comfort now, though. His tactical awareness never fully disappeared. Even as he focused on capturing the mountain's natural beauty, he had chosen this spot specifically for its dramatic cliff faces and sweeping valley views. But now those same features took on new significance. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the campground as Marcus packed his camera bag, checking and rechecking his equipment. While maintaining his habitual awareness of his surroundings, he noticed a park ranger's vehicle pulling into the campground, its arrival likely prompted by reports from other campers about the previous night's disturbance. The ranger, a woman in her mid-30s with alert eyes and a purposeful stride, approached his site. "Afternoon, sir," she greeted him professionally. "I'm Ranger Sarah Collins. We received some concerning reports about a disturbance last night." Marcus nodded, setting his camera down and giving her his full attention, though his peripheral vision continued to scan their surroundings. "Some troublemakers," he confirmed, keeping his response measured but accurate. "They've moved on." The ranger's expression showed both concern and curiosity as she pulled out a notepad, as Marcus provided a detailed account of the events. His training automatically kicked in, delivering precise descriptions of Tank and his crew, their vehicle, their behavior, and their likely destinations. He noticed how the ranger's professional demeanor shifted slightly as she recognized his military background in the way he reported the incident. "We've had problems with similar groups in other campgrounds." She admitted their descriptions match a gang that's been harassing campers across several state parks. The conversation shifted as the ranger shared information about other incidents. Marcus listened carefully, his mind already mapping patterns and connections, just as he had done during intelligence briefings in his service days. The gang had been moving systematically through remote campgrounds, targeting isolated campers and families, their methodology suggesting a level of organization that went beyond simple harassment. "You handled it well," the ranger observed, studying him with newfound respect. "Most people either escalate the situation or become victims." Marcus shrugged slightly, remembering Rivera's teachings about control and presence. "I had good training," he replied simply. The ranger nodded understanding more than she voiced, making additional notes in her pad before providing him with contact information in case the group returned as the ranger departed. Marcus returned to preparing his camera equipment, though his mind processed the new information, calculating potential scenarios and response strategies. He had chosen photography as a way to find peace after his service, but his military instincts remained sharp, ready to activate when needed. The afternoon light painted the cliffs in warm golden hues perfect for capturing dramatic landscapes, but his attention remained split between his art and his surroundings. Other campers approached throughout the afternoon, each sharing their own perspectives on the previous night's events. Marcus listened carefully, noting how the community had come together. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a young family stopped by their children, excited to show him the walking sticks they had found. While their parents expressed their gratitude for his intervention, he accepted their thanks quietly, maintaining his unassuming presence while remaining alert. The afternoon progressed peacefully as Marcus photographed the dramatic cliff faces, his camera capturing nature's raw beauty, while his trained senses remained attuned to his environment. He thought about Tank and his crew, wondering if they would attempt similar intimidation at other campgrounds, the ranger's information suggesting a pattern that might require further attention. He considered contacting some of his old connections, sharing intelligence that might help prevent future incidents as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley. Marcus reviewed his photographs on his camera's display screen, each image telling a story of wilderness and solitude, so different from the chaos of the previous night. A group of hikers passed by, their excited chatter about trail conditions and wildlife sightings, adding to the peaceful atmosphere. He noticed how they moved confidently through the campground. The fear from the previous night completely dissolved. The mountain. Air grew cooler as evening approached. Marcus secured his camera equipment and began preparing his campsite for night, his movements automatic and efficient. Born from years of military discipline, he thought about how his life had changed from securing forward, operating bases in combat zones to capturing natural beauty through his lens. Yet the core principles remained the same: awareness, preparation, readiness. His chosen profession might have changed, but the fundamental skills that had kept him alive in combat still served him well. Frank approached again as the evening settled in, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, handing Marcus one of the cups, "word about last night has spread through the campground." Marcus accepted the coffee with a nod, noting how information traveled quickly in small communities, whether in mountain campgrounds or combat zones. Frank settled into a nearby chair, his expression suggesting he had more to share. "They're saying, 'You saved the whole campground,'" Frank continued, "though we both know it was more about preventing something bad from happening than actually fighting." Marcus nodded, appreciating how the older veteran understood the nuance of the situation sometimes. "The best victories are the ones where nothing seems to happen," he replied, remembering Rivera's teachings about conflict resolution. The evening light painted the cliffs in deep oranges and purples as Marcus and Frank shared the comfortable silence of men who understood the weight of service and the importance of vigilance. Even in peaceful moments, other campers prepared their evening meals, the sound of laughter and conversation carrying across the campground, creating a sharp contrast to the previous night's tension. Marcus observed it all, his trained eye, noting both the peace of the present and any potential threats that might disturb it as darkness began to fall. Marcus thought about how his military experience had shaped his approach to civilian life, how the skills he had learned in special forces, from situational awareness to conflict resolution, continued to serve him and others in unexpected ways. He had chosen this remote location for its photographic opportunities, but fate had other plans, reminding him that sometimes the most important missions come when you least expect them. The mountain night settled in, bringing with it a profound sense of peace that seemed to wash away the last remnants of the previous evening's confrontation. Marcus sat by his fire, watching as the stars emerged one by one in the clear sky. The storm clouds having long since departed, He thought about how quickly situations could change from tension to tranquility. His years in, Special Forces had taught him that these quiet moments were precious, but required just as much vigilance as times of conflict. Ranger Collins's truck appeared again, making one final patrol through the campground before night fully descended. She stopped briefly at Marcus's sight, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you told me earlier," she said. "Climbing out of the vehicle, we've had reports of similar incidents at Broken Ridge and Eagles Point." Marcus nodded, absorbing the information, his mind automatically mapping the locations and identifying patterns just as he had done during mission briefings. The same group, she continued, likely targeting remote campgrounds, specifically choosing locations where law enforcement response would be delayed. Marcus listened carefully, noting how the gang's methodology suggested a level of organization that went beyond simple opportunistic harassment. "They're escalating," he observed quietly, remembering how Tank's crew had carried weapons and tactical gear items that seemed excessive for simple campground intimidation. The ranger shared more details about other incidents, each one fitting a pattern that Marcus recognized from his military experience. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated operations designed to exploit vulnerable targets in isolated areas. He thought about Tank's crew, their attempted show of force, masking a level of organization that deserved attention. "You should coordinate with neighboring jurisdictions," he suggested, drawing from his experience in tracking hostile forces. As Ranger Collins departed Marcus's mind worked through the implications of this larger pattern. He had encountered similar situations during his service, where local incidents were often part of broader criminal operations. His training had taught him to look beyond immediate confrontations. To understand the bigger picture, he wondered if Tank's crew was part of a larger network using remote campgrounds as staging areas for more serious criminal activities. The campfire crackled softly as Marcus considered his options. He had contacts from his service days, people who could help track and stop these types of operations, but he had left that life behind, choosing instead to find peace through his photography. Yet as he watched the flames dance, he remembered Rivera's words about responsibility. Sometimes the mission finds you, whether you're looking for it or not. Frank approached through the darkness, carrying an evening meal to share his movement, catching Marcus's attention long before he entered the firelight. "You're thinking about going after them, aren't you?" the older veteran asked, setting down the food, his insight born from his own years of service. Marcus smiled slightly at how easily Frank had read his thoughts. "Some habits die hard," he replied, thinking about how military training created instincts that never truly faded. They shared a meal under the stars, their conversation touching on their respective service experiences. Though both men carefully avoided the classified details that civilians didn't need. To hear Frank spoke about his time in Vietnam, how his unit had tracked enemy movements through similar terrain. Marcus listened, recognizing the parallel between those past operations and the current situation with Tank's crew. Different decades, different enemies, but the same principles of tracking and interdiction. The night grew deeper as other campers settled into their tents, the peaceful sounds of the mountain returning. Marcus maintained his vigilance even in these quiet moments, his trained senses alert to any disturbance. His mind continued to process the information Ranger Collins had shared, analyzing potential patterns and predicting future targets. He had spent years developing these skills in combat zones, and now they served a different but equally important purpose. A family at a nearby campsite prepared for bed, their children's excited whispers about tomorrow's hiking plans carrying across the quiet night. Marcus watched them, thinking about how vulnerable such families would be to groups like Tank's crew. He remembered similar scenes from his deployments. Innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of larger conflicts. The parallel strengthened his resolve to ensure these peaceful mountain retreats remained safe. The fire died down to glowing embers as Marcus and Frank continued their conversation, sharing insights that only veterans could truly understand. They spoke about how military service shaped their perspectives, how the skills they had learned continued to influence their civilian lives. Frank understood without explanation why Marcus couldn't simply ignore the larger threat that Tank's crew represented sometimes. He said quietly, "You can't walk away from what needs to be done." Marcus nodded, thinking about the Rangers' reports. The pattern of incidents across multiple campgrounds, he knew from experience that such patterns rarely resolved themselves without intervention. His training had taught him to recognize threats before they fully developed, to take action when necessary, rather than waiting for situations to escalate beyond control. The peaceful mountain night seemed to demand a response, a commitment to protect what he had found here, as Frank prepared to return to his own site. He paused, looking at Marcus with understanding. "You'll do what needs to be done," he said simply. It wasn't a question. Marcus recognized the tone, the quiet certainty that came from years of service where duty and responsibility became ingrained beyond conscious choice. He thought about his camera equipment, his plans for capturing the mountain's beauty, how quickly priorities could shift when circumstances demanded. The night air grew cooler as Marcus began preparing for sleep. Though his mind continued to work through scenarios and possibilities, he thought about Tank's crew, their tactics, their organization, their choice of targets, his military training, automatically analyzing strengths, weaknesses, and potential vulnerabilities. He knew that sometimes the most effective operations began with careful observation and planning rather than immediate action. Stars wheeled overhead as Marcus conducted one final check of his campsite. His movements precise and efficient. Even in the darkness, he thought about how his life had led him here, from special forces operations to mountain photography. Yet somehow the skills and instincts he had developed continued to serve a purpose he hadn't expected tomorrow would bring new decisions, new responsibilities. But for now, he maintained his quiet vigilance, watching over the peaceful campground as the mountain night deepened. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the mountain air crisp with possibility. Marcus sat by his rekindled fire, preparing for the day ahead, his decision already made with the clarity that years of service had taught him he would track Tank's crew not for revenge or glory, but because his training and experience uniquely positioned him to stop their escalating pattern of violence. His camera equipment lay packed beside new gear maps and supplies that spoke of a different kind of mission. Ranger Collins arrived early, her truck kicking up dust as she pulled into the campground. She had brought detailed reports of other incidents, coordinates, and witness statements that painted a clear picture of the gang's movement patterns. Marcus studied the information with the same intensity he had once applied to mission briefings in Afghanistan, noting patterns that might escape civilian law enforcement. The gang was moving systematically through remote campgrounds, each incident becoming more aggressive. "You don't have to do this," the ranger said, watching as Marcus marked potential locations on his map, but her tone suggested she understood why he would. He looked up from his planning, his expression carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had made peace with his decision. Sometimes he replied, "We don't choose our missions, they choose us." The words carried the weight of experience earned through years of service in places where duty and necessity often intersected. Frank appeared as Marcus finished his preparations, the older veteran carrying coffee, and an understanding that went beyond words. "You're going after them," he stated simply, recognizing the familiar signs of pre-mission preparation in Marcus's methodical movements. Marcus nodded, accepting the coffee while continuing to study the terrain. "Maps, they're targeting families," he said quietly. "People who come here for peace. The same peace I found after leaving service." Frank's expression showed complete understanding. The morning progressed as Marcus prepared for his departure, his military training evident in every aspect of his planning. He had already identified likely routes the gang would take, calculated their probable next targets based on their established pattern. Other campers stopped by throughout the morning, many offering information about similar incidents they had heard about or witnessed, each detail adding to the larger picture Marcus was assembling. "You'll need help," Ranger Collins said, returning with additional maps and reports. But Marcus shook his head slightly, remembering countless solo operations in hostile territory. Better to move alone, he replied, faster, quieter, safer. The ranger nodded, respecting his experience, but insisted on establishing communication protocols and emergency responses, her law enforcement. Training, aligning with his military background in understanding the importance of proper planning. As the sun climbed higher, Marcus made his final preparations, his gear now a curious mixture of photography equipment and tactical necessities. He thought about how his two worlds had merged in unexpected ways. His camera would serve both as cover and reconnaissance tool, while his military skills would ensure the safety of future campers. Frank watched the preparations with knowing eyes, occasionally offering insights from his own experience tracking enemies through difficult terrain. Campground had returned to its peaceful routine, families preparing for hikes, children playing between the trees. But Marcus saw it differently now, his trained eye noting vulnerable approaches, areas that needed protection points that could be exploited by those with harmful intentions. He had chosen this place for its beauty and solitude. But now he understood that sometimes maintaining peace required action. Before departing, Marcus spent time with Frank and Ranger Collins, establishing communication, plans, and sharing his tactical assessment of the situation. His military experience translating easily into terms they could understand and act upon if necessary. He marked safe routes for civilian campers, identified potential danger zones, and established emergency protocols, his planning thorough and methodical, just as his Special Forces training had ingrained. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Marcus prepared for departure, his gear checked and rechecked with military precision. He thought about Tank's crew, their pattern of escalating violence, their targeting of vulnerable families. His decision to act felt right, aligning with both his military training and his personal code. Other campers gathered to wish him well there, gratitude evident though few understood the full scope of what he planned. Frank approached one final time as Marcus shouldered his pack, the older veteran's expression carrying the weight of shared experience. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "Simply sometimes we have to use our training to protect what we've found." Marcus nodded, understanding flowing between them. He had come to these mountains seeking peace through his photography, but his Special Forces experience had given him the tools to ensure others could find that same peace. As Marcus prepared to depart, Ranger Collins provided one last update on reported incidents, her law enforcement perspective, complementing his military experience. They had tracked the gang's movement, pattern identifying likely next targets. He absorbed the information, his mind already formulating approaches and contingencies, just as he had done countless times during his service. "You'll be careful out there," she said, though it wasn't really a question. The mountain afternoon was turning golden as Marcus began his departure, his movements purposeful and measured. He had chosen this life of peace and photography after leaving service. But sometimes peace needed guardians, he thought about. Tank's crew, their attempted intimidation, their targeting of vulnerable families, their escalating pattern of violence. His military training had prepared him for exactly this type of mission, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The campground grew quiet behind him as he moved into the wilderness, his skills and training once again serving a greater purpose than he had anticipated. When he first sought solitude in these mountains, he carried with him not just his gear, but the responsibility that came with his unique experience, the ability to track, stop, and prevent those who would bring violence to peaceful places. As he disappeared into the mountain terrain, his mind was clear, his purpose defined. He would ensure these mountains remained a sanctuary for those seeking peace, even if that meant returning briefly to the warrior he had once been. Months passed after Marcus's tracking mission, the seasons shifting from late summer to early winter, bringing fresh snow to the peaks around. Eagles Point Campground. The mountains he had come to think of as home stood silent and majestic, the crisp air carrying memories of challenges faced and peace restored. Marcus sat by his familiar campfire, his camera beside him, evidence of his return to the quiet life he had chosen. But something had shifted in the way he viewed this sanctuary. The gang's activities had been shut down systematically across 3 states, their pattern of intimidation ending not with violence, but with careful coordination between law enforcement agencies. Marcus's intelligence had proven invaluable, leading to multiple arrests including Tank and his core group, his military expertise translating perfectly into the kind of strategic planning that civilian authorities needed to track and stop organized criminal activities. Ranger Collins visited occasionally, bringing updates about the positive changes in the mountain parks. Since Tank's crew had been apprehended, families had returned in greater numbers to the remote campgrounds, their confidence restored by the knowledge that someone had stood up to those who would disturb their peace. The ranger would share coffee with Marcus, discussing how the incident had led to improved security protocols across the park system, though both knew that the real security lay in the vigilance of people who cared. Frank had become a regular presence, his own military experience creating a bridge between Marcus's past and present. They would sit by the fire, sharing the comfortable silence of veterans who understood that some battles were fought not with weapons, but with presence and determination. Other campers, particularly those who had witnessed the confrontation, treated Marcus with a quiet respect, though he remained as unassuming as ever, his camera still his most visible tool. The elderly camper whose harassment had triggered the original confrontation returned to Eagles Point, bringing his grandchildren. This time Marcus watched from his sight as 3 generations explored the wilderness together, their laughter carrying across the campground a reminder of why he had chosen to act. The old man caught his eye one afternoon and raised his coffee cup in a silent salute, understanding passing between them about the importance of standing firm when others might retreat. Marcus's photography had evolved too, his lens capturing not just the raw beauty of the landscape but also the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the way morning mist clung to the cliffs like memories of past conflicts. His images seemed to carry more depth now, as if his experience had added new layers to how he saw the world. Some of his photos had been featured in outdoor magazines, though few knew the full story of the photographer who took them. The satellite phone remained within reach, a habit Marcus wouldn't break, but its purpose had shifted from emergency backup to a link with the network of park rangers and law enforcement officials who now saw him as an unofficial guardian of the mountain parks. He had found a balance between his desire for solitude and his ingrained sense of responsibility, his presence alone deterring those who might consider these remote locations easy targets. One crisp morning, as Marcus prepared his camera gear for a dawn shoot, he reflected on how life had come full circle. The peace he sought after leaving Special Forces hadn't meant abandoning his training, but rather finding new ways to apply it. The mountains had taught him that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones, where threats were dissolved before they could materialize, where strength lay not in confrontation, but in preparedness. The campground had changed subtly since that night. Security protocols were stronger, communication between sites more efficient. But the real change was in the community itself. Campers looked out for each other, shared resources and information, creating the kind of mutual support that Marcus had known in his military days. The incident with Tank's crew had reminded everyone that peace wasn't just the absence of conflict, but the presence of people willing to maintain it as winter settled over the mountains. Marcus continued his dual role of photographer and quiet guardian, his camera capturing the dramatic play of light on snow-covered peaks, while his trained senses remained alert to the rhythm of the campground. He had found his place in this wilderness, a balance between the warrior he had been and the artist he had become, each role enriching the other in ways he hadn't expected. The story of the confrontation had become something of a legend in the camping community, passed around campfires as both warning and reassurance. But Marcus knew the real lesson wasn't about one night's victory over troublemakers. It was about the ongoing choice to remain vigilant, to stand ready to protect the peace that others sought in these mountains. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles were the ones prevented by simple presence and preparedness. Marcus watched the sun rise over the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold. His camera ready to capture the moment, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settled comfortably alongside his chosen path. He had found his Way not by leaving his past behind, but by transforming it, using the skills honed in combat to preserve the peace of this place he called home. The mountains stood silent around him, their ancient presence a reminder that some guardians worked best. In quiet ways, their strength felt but rarely seen, their victories marked not by conquest, but by the simple sound of families laughing in the wilderness without fear.